Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are on this fast forward planet, which is, among other things, still wrapped in a pandemic. Sometimes it doesn't feel that way. SARS-CoV-2 has evolved through into strains that are easily transmitted but less devastating. There's still significant gaps of vaccination in mostly in countries that are the most vulnerable to any kind of health hazard. And that leads to persistent work to be done on that. It's a human-heated planet, and that has been evident all around the world, as I started writing about in 1988, but is now much more about the present than the future. It's a planet that is wrapped in conflict right now. You don't have to be in Ukraine where things are focused, this devastating impact of the Vladimir Putin's invasion, but it has ramified around the world through an energy crisis and a food crisis as well. And both of those things can put pressure on ecosystems. Throughout Europe, there are people cutting down forests that were for fuel. It's starting to, because winter is coming in the northern hemisphere, and this is including in areas that are preserved theoretically, and that leads to the subject today, which is biological diversity. I've been on that beat as well since the 1980s, and I'm joined by some amazing colleagues here today, and a fantastic scientist who has focused her work on conservation policy for a long time through the Wildlife Conservation Society, the International Union of Conservation of Nature. And two of the people on screen are at the treaty talks in Montreal. We were just focused on COP27, and there was also COP19, which was the CITES, the other Endangered Species Treaty. And now at Montreal is this 30-year-old Convention on Biological Diversity. I'm just going to play this little introductory video from the folks at the UN to get us started. And I just can't, really honored to have this particular group and
Biodiversity is the web of life that connects us all.
And for too long, we have been waging a senseless and suicidal war on nature. We need a bold global agreement that tackles the key drivers of biodiversity loss. We need to close the biodiversity finance gap of approximately $700 billion a year by 2030.
We must secure the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities.
When we conserve biodiversity, use it sustainably, and share its benefit equitably, we get that much closer to building a shared future for all.
框架将指导我们扭转生物多样性丧失的局面。
This is an ambitious goal. It's absolutely within reach.
We need to see a massive political lift for nature.
Ultimately, our survival depends on it.
yeah, so here we are. Our survival, sorry, stop that. Our survival does, to a large extent, depend on the systems we rely on for food, for energy in some cases, and certainly for our spiritual sustainability as well. Anyone who's, I think everyone in this conversation today had some moment with non-human life that led them to focus their work on this issue and challenge. So we'll start right in with the introduction. And the question I'm going to ask each of you is, what pulled you to this particular focal point for your work, the journalism and the science and conservation work? Again, there are challenges all around from pandemics to basic science and biology, and we could all be doing something else. But why this? Let's just start with our science guest, Madhu Rao, who just got a position. She's a senior advisor for Asia for the Wildlife Conservation Society, but has now taken a position of the Commission on Protected Areas at the IUCN. So, Dr. Rao, could you just tell us where you're from originally? What pulled you into this arena, and what drove you to the particular challenge of conservation at this scale?
Thanks, Andy. Great to be here. So I am originally from India. I was born in Bangalore, a city in southern India. And I did my early education there. And I was always interested in nature. But I trained as a scientist, actually as a community ecologist. And I looked at, for my doctoral research, I looked at the effects of collapsing ecosystems, and what happens if top predators in the ecosystem are taken away. What happens? How do these effects trigger down to the bottom levels? So I actually studied leafcutter ants in a Venezuelan dry tropical forest. So the science was all very interesting, but I think I was more interested in how the science is applied to solve conservation problems in the field. So that's how I started to work with the Wildlife Conservation Society, and it's been my home since I graduated from graduate school. So it was interesting for me to see how to apply the science to the field conservation problems, and so I spent a lot of time supporting the development of projects, on the ground projects, looking at exploitation of wildlife, the creation of protected areas. And then I sort of gradually became interested in the extent to which science influenced policy. And I could see, I still see that there's a lot of science being generated, but I became interested in how is science getting into policy, and that sort of brought me to where I am as the chair of the World Commission on Protected Areas.
That's great. So from ecology to sort of the human ecology of decision making. And so we have Katrine Einhorn, who's at the New York Times at a beat that didn't exist until you took it on or pitched it. Back in the day when I was at the New York Times, as an environment reporter, I was covering biodiversity loss, I was covering climate change, I was covering pollution policy, but this is a big story. And how did you, Katrine, make that what it is now at the Times, its own beat?
Yeah, I've just been a generalist as a reporter for my career really until recently. But it's really another journalist who I know you've had on, Elizabeth Kolbert, Kolbert, is that how you pronounce her name? I never know actually how you pronounce
Kolbert, yeah.
Kolbert. And it was reading her coverage on climate first that really opened my eyes to sort of the scale of the climate crisis. And then it was reading Sixth Extinction that really opened my eyes to this other aspect of it. And I sort of got to the point where I had lots of good stories in my notebook that I didn't want to do because all I wanted to do was focus on the environment in some way. And so, just looking at that time at the Times, there was a climate pod, but the biodiversity extinction kind of wildlife stories were sort of split. Sometimes the climate pod did them, sometimes science did them. And we had great freelancers doing a lot of that coverage, but there was no reporter who was sort of charged with that. And so, I talked to editors about that and they said, great, do it.
That's so great. And could you just describe your background? You've done all kinds of journalism, including film, documentary.
Yeah. I was a radio reporter, first a public radio reporter at WBEZ in Chicago for many years. And then I moved to the Chicago Bureau of the New York Times. But I always, because of that sort of radio background, I've always just wanted, whatever medium I'm working in, I want to be working in a different medium. It's like the problem of my life. So I became very interested in documentary and ended up following a soldier, and then who was then a veteran for many years, and that ended up as a documentary on Netflix. Yeah, so I did some reporting on the sexual harassment stuff. I've did a great series on great not because I was involved, but just great because it was so fun to work on. It was this series on Syrian refugees in Canada, actually, which of course we'll be talking about, but they have private sponsorship. And so we sort of followed these groups of Syrian refugees through their sponsorship in Canada for the first year. It was really, really fun reporting.
And this story is just up, right? I think.
Yeah,
today.
Just published today. I'm glad it published before this talk so that I am not too distracted.
And maybe you could just give the headline summary.
Yeah, I mean, it's a story. It really focuses on habitat loss because, it seems like, in fact, it sort of the idea for it came out of conversations I had around starting this beat, is that it seemed like everyone who I talked to about it, not everyone, many people, including like really informed people, really assumed that problems with wildlife were all related to climate change. Like they thought that climate change was driving biodiversity loss. And of course, we expect that to become the main driver in coming decades. But, as you all know, really habitat loss is just this persistent problem. And so it was a way, I just kind of wanted to find a way to make a big, compelling statement tied to the talks in Montreal to try and bring readers in. It's hard to write about UN conferences in a way that really grabs readers. So this was sort of our attempt to try and bring them into this conversation.
I think it's a great attempt, and it's also been really fun to watch the Times work with graphics in ways that when I was there weren't conceivable. These sort of flowing images of the species in question with the tags and stuff.
And just so this data that's underlying this comes from Map of Life. So they shared their data with us, and that's how we were able to show these species that have lost, an estimated third or more of habitat over the last 20 years. So that was the other thing. It was like to show readers that this is happening right now.
And this whole idea of sparing land for nature is a huge focus of this conference. So Janine, Rhett Butler is here as well, who is the founder and CEO of Manga Bay. Rhett, it'd be great to talk to you in a second. But Janine, you're on site there in Montreal with Madhu Rao, and let's hear from you a little bit about what pulled you in. You're what's really neat is that you're at carbonbrief.org, which is mostly a climate-focused, emissions-focused entity, but they seem to have gotten the land issue into that mix. So just tell us about your journey. What brought you to journalism, why conservation, and what's your goal there at the COP15?
Thank you very much, Andrew. And for me, it's an honor. I'm very honored and thankful for being here with you, sharing this useful space with all of your audiences. And I studied journalism. I'm a Mexican environmental journalist, and I started reporting environment and climate change since, I don't know, like 2018, more or less. And I have like 4 years of experience covering these topics for Mexican media outlets, newspapers, but also digital ones. And more recently, I had a chance to join Manga Bay as a freelancer journalist, as well as China Dialogue. Both of them are media outlets focused more on Latin America. And the kind of stories that I used to cover there were more like in situ coverages. I traveled, for instance, to Southeast Mexico, and I reported some initiatives of indigenous and local communities to do sustainable forest management and other topics like carbon offsets or adaptation to climate change in Mexico City also. And I have this perspective of what's going on in the region about climate change and sustainable use of nature. These topics are really important for our region because we have a lot of biodiversity hotspots that we are aware of, and we would like to conserve and protect. And how did I come to Carbon Brief? It's a very recent story because, yeah, I have joined Carbon Brief the last week. So
Amazing.
yeah, I'm very excited about this. And I am part of a team that is covering food, land, and nature. With other 3 colleagues and my editor, who is Juliana Biglione. And yeah, we are covering these topics right now here. We are here at COP15, and we are sort of trying to do compelling and profound coverage of the COP15, regarding these topics, but also other ones like like oceans or the 30 per 30 target. Indigenous rights are also one of the topics that I'm more focused on, and yeah, I think that we are very, very committed to still covering these topics to a more international audience.
That's great. And this, we'll talk maybe about the value of local coverage in countries like Mexico versus sort of New York Times coverage aimed at kind of policy, the policy level. Both are really important, and they're very different and distinct. So Rhett Butler, you just won the Heinz Foundation's, the Heinz Award for your pioneering work, pulling together this thing called Manga Bay, which is, to me, I can't think of any initiative, journalistic reporting project that's been so focused on the key issue of biodiversity conservation. So first of all, congratulations. I was on that webcast with you recently there. But if you could take the temperature of things right now compared to 10 years ago, let's say, on, is the reporters who work for Manga Bay, is the crisis worse, or is there prospects of change? Is this conference, and we'll hear from Madhu on this again too, is this conference sort of pasting on commitments that are sort of like, in the climate context, net zero someday, or is there some reality building here? So Rhett, thanks for being on.
Well, thanks for having me, Andy. Yeah, I mean, so there's been a lot of changes since I started Manga Bay, which was in the late 90s. I would say, you asked specifically about the last 10 years. I think there has been a big shift in awareness about biodiversity loss and first of all, that it's happening, which is partly a product of better monitoring, but then also understanding why it matters. And so I feel like scientists and journalists and NGOs have gotten much better at communicating why this is relevant to us. And so I think that that's very important. We've still seen kind of this lag in, commitments actually being implemented. And so I think there were some bold commitments at the last biodiversity COP in 2010. And kind of the general feeling is that those goals were not met. I think most people would agree with that. And so I think people are wary this time of, whether we can avoid repeating some of those mistakes and addressing some of those key issues. But I think people are also realistic that there's only so much you kind of achieve through a UN process. And I think we've seen that also from, on the climate side. And so, there's just fundamental questions about how significant is this? But, the UN is very useful for kind of setting these high level frameworks and kind of setting the low bar, I guess. And so I think it is positive. There is more focus on this. There's links to climate. So I think, it's a lot different than, say, 10 years ago. In terms of your earlier question about how I got into doing this. So like the others, I mean, I think I was inspired early on. So really from a young age, I was very interested in biodiversity. I mean, specifically, I was really into frogs and reptiles. And I had this opportunity to travel the Amazon when I was pretty young, and we stayed with a fairly traditional indigenous community. And I came back from that trip, and then there was an oil spill on that river. And so I immediately wondered what had happened to the animals, and then, my friends in the forest. And that kind of moved me from someone who, casually appreciated nature to someone who started tracking environmental issues. And then the thing that actually moved me to become a journalist and try to do things was another experience I had in Borneo, where beautiful forest had this, this real moment with a connection with a wild animal, where a wild orangutan passed overhead, came back, and that forest was destroyed. And so this habitat loss is what led me to become a journalist and want to inform people. So that's kind of my origin story.
And actually, this is a good time to get back to that question. Madhu, we're going to get into the nuts and bolts of the conference too, but was there a moment for you, Madhu, just as a kid or growing up or in your science, some particular interaction or loss or a moment?
Yeah, I mean, I think growing up, I remember going to a wildlife sanctuary, and it was a wildlife sanctuary in India, and I remember being quite young, and I was just mesmerized by the forest. It was dry tropical forest, but it was just teeming with birds, and lots and lots of mammals, primates and ungulates, and it was just all very beautiful at the time, and I just felt then that it's something that I'd like to be engaged with in some form, and I just stuck with it.
Same for Katrine and Janina. Katrine, was there some interaction with nature? Again, as your beat as a journalist has been so wide, but there must have been something that pulled you toward this priority. Katrine,
I don't know. I'm thinking. I don't know that I can name like a moment. I think, just given the stakes of these environmental crises that we're facing, I think participating in some of the sexual harassment reporting that we did, and my colleagues Jody Cantor and Megan Toohey sort of helping to set off Me Too, helped me realize what an impact journalism can have. I think sometimes it's hard to remember that, right? As a journalist, it was such a dramatic example of that, and I think that it made me feel like, okay, like there are these global crises. There's, I have kids, like I want to be able to like look them in the eyes and say, I'm a journalist. I'm not, I'm a journalist, so my action can only be through journalism. I'm a New York Times journalist, and so I better write about this stuff because that's what I can do.
Yeah, then the legacy issue too, right? Having kids, thinking about what we're leaving. That's part of the challenge of climate too, is CO2, once it's in the atmosphere, produces this lingering, building, cumulative impact on the state of the world, not just now, but for centuries. And extinction is similar. So those two things, where the loss is irreparable, or certainly irreversible, feels like key sources of what drives a lot of people too. Janina, where did you grow up in Mexico? Were you in a city or in the country, a rural area?
Yeah, I was born in Mexico City, and yeah, I remember when I was a child. Sorry, my father and I always watched documentaries, natural documentaries, and since then I was also mesmerized by this of living in our planet. And I think that after that, at college, I decided to get more engaged to these issues, just because I always informed about news on these topics since I was a student. So yeah, and I didn't have the opportunity to visit many ecosystems or places in my country when I was a child, but right now, as a journalist, I had this like kind of privilege of travel to different places here, in my country, and meet how is the conservation implementing in these regions. So yeah, I consider that I was involved with these issues in an earlier stage of my life.
It's great to hear. I'm just going to show an image. I was thinking about this myself too. For me, before I was a journalist, in my early 20s, I ended up very serendipitously on the crew of a sailboat that was going around the world. And we were in the Red Sea. We were entering the Red Sea after crossing the Indian Ocean, 21 days, the Western Indian Ocean. We went to Djibouti. And this is 1980. We're in Djibouti, which is this, at that time, a French colony full of French Foreign Legion and Air Force. And I was walking down the street and there was this tobacco shop. And I noticed that there was it was piled with skins of leopards. There were leopard skins. I took this picture and I felt that was one of the moments that drew me toward journalism. I wasn't a journalist yet. I had a biology degree and I thought, God, I just have to let the world think about this. What is this? I wasn't thinking about the word sustainability yet, but it felt very unsustainable to think that in this desert landscape, in this isolated French colony, that there was a pile of leopard skins at a tobacco shop. So it's and then getting from that to the intricacies of these conventions seems challenging. One of the things that I want to ask you all about is when you try to, either as a journalist, looking for the stories, or as a, in the negotiations, they're trying to influence how things play out. It's very easy to say 30 by 30. And for those who don't know that, this the commitment to by 2030 to have protection for 30% of the world's land area. I think it's land area. Is that right, Madhu?
It's both land and
Land
sea.
and sea.
Yeah.
So it's easy to kind of draw those general numbers, but I kept saying, well, which 30? How is that dispersed? How much is in Indonesia? How much is in Mexico? How much is in, where are the hotspots for biodiversity loss? Does this all intersect with that? And what are the cultural and political realities of these different places? There's no one story. There's no story, Katrine, or I could write in the New York Times that says this is the way to do this, because it's like this landscape. So maybe Madhu and Janine, because you're at the meeting, and then Rhett and Katrine, what's your sense of that? What do we have to do? What can be done to facilitate those regional actions that lead up to a global outcome?
Thanks, Andy. If I can just jump in here.
Yeah.
I think the 30 by 30 target is the most, if I can say, the most important of the global biodiversity framework. It's extremely ambitious, but the ambition is deemed necessary to stem the deterioration of nature. But as you've said, I mean, it's been quite difficult in some places for people to accept the importance of actually getting to this, because they said, well, we didn't do very well in the previous target, which was the Aichi target, which had 17% of lands and seas. So we just about made it on the terrestrial front, and woefully quite low in the seas, in the marine side of things. But I think regionally it is important to sort of get to start talking to people in countries to say, okay, why is this important? And why is it achievable? And why is it necessary to do this time round? And as Rhett had said, I mean, there's so much more information now on why it's important, why it is a crisis, and why we have to do differently at this point. So the challenge is in implementation, Andy. As you've sort of hinted, it's really getting to how do we implement this on the ground. What will it take in terms of national policy changes? How can we mainstream biodiversity into national policies? That's where the challenge is going to be for this target and for this framework.
And Rhett, one of the amazing things about Mongabay is you publish in, what is it, 8? Is it 8 languages?
We produce original content in 6 right now, but we adapt to others.
Yeah, that work and the work of Earth Journalism Network, which is this global array of journalists trying to improve conservation and doing sometimes regional conservation, feels really like a good fit for this. When I was at the National Geographic Society trying to build some programs, there, I kept saying, what could we do to further facilitate environmental coverage in these regions to build that awareness that Madhu Rao was talking about, as distinct from the traditional National Geographic approach, which was to take a famed photographer and send them to a country for many months and build a really beautiful story for the magazine. Do you feel like this is catching on, or what could be done to, if you agree, that enriching and nurturing regional journalism to capture these realities in ways that drive progress? How far behind are we in doing that? I'll just add that Antonio Guterres, in that video we saw at the beginning, said something like $700 billion a year has to be spent to accomplish this goal. But that won't happen unless there's, enthusiasm and understanding.
Yeah, I mean, so, there are these high-level agreements, but action takes place on the ground. So it's really critical to have that connection between the macro and the micro scales, because if you don't have progress at the micro level, you can't get these macro outcomes. And so, one of the things we try to do at Mongabay is to get those stories really from the front lines. And I think in terms of whether it's a trend in journalism, it's hard to say. I mean, I feel like within the biodiversity space, it's happening more and more. So you mentioned Earth Journalism Network. I mean, they do a wonderful job of building capacity of journalists in these biodiversity hotspots to cover these issues. And, we're certainly doing it at Mongabay. I probably don't have the visibility to say whether it's a trend across the sector, but it's definitely important. And I mean, just as a micro example, one of the things we've done recently at Mongabay is we've been doing more and more reporting on the contributions Indigenous peoples and local communities make towards achieving conservation outcomes. That might not be the goal of how they live their lives, but by virtue of how they live, you tend to have more biodiversity and healthier ecosystems in Indigenous territories. And so I think there's much greater recognition now in the conservation space about how important it is to recognize Indigenous peoples and local communities' rights. And so at Mongabay, we've been reporting on this issue for a long time. We've been scaling up. But one of the things we found is that we recently built an Indigenous news desk, which has people who identify as Indigenous. And because these reporters who identify Indigenous, when they go to these communities, there's sort of a faster way to make this connection and build that trust, because a lot of Indigenous communities have sort of been besieged by so long from the outside world that it takes a little while between a journalist and a source to build up that relationship. And so if people are coming from a similar background, it can just accelerate that process and get you a different type of reporting. And so we see it as being really critical to have this local reporting that can then bubble up and inform kind of these high-level global trends. And so by having people in all these different countries, they can do local reporting, and then you can have it come together and report on, this is happening in Indonesia, this is happening in Mexico, this is happening in DRC. What are the commonalities and what are the differences? And so it adds like a lot of nuance that we wouldn't otherwise be able to get.
Can I just add that often when I'm like, there's, a theme that I'm looking at and I'm talking to scientists and I'm asking for examples from all over the world and the most emblematic examples, and then they give me some and then I Google them and then Mongabay has already written about it. So you guys are doing incredible work.
It's well, it is an ecosystem in that way. Hopefully, when I was blogging at the New York Times along with my stories, half the time I was pointing to other work. I think the more that we can find a way to shift away, there's been a trend in online journalism to just sort of link to your own stuff, to, for whether it's the New York Times, the Washington Post, BBC, it's all sort of trying to own the story as opposed to capturing the story, including through other lenses.
I think that's shifting. I think there's a lot of us in journalism who are trying to not be so I don't know, it's like selfish is the word that's coming to mind, but it's not quite that. Just to really be, give credit where credit is due, right? And certainly we have, I mean, in the example that I'm thinking of, I remember I said to my editor, Manga Bay wrote about this, we should link to their story. And he said, absolutely. And we did.
Good. That's good. The more, the better. I'm showing some of your work there, by the way. And we all share a concern. The vaquita, here's one thing we can talk about, and Madhu, you as well. There are charismatic fauna, right? And Rhett, as you know, one of my favorite projects you guys did at Manga Bay was your almost famous. That was the tagline, and it was sort of non-charismatic fauna, megafauna. But at the same time, these species matter. So I would like to ask each of you how you sort of do your own internal prioritization between telling stories like of the vaquita, which I've written at least 8 pieces about, some for the Times, some for my Substack, and here too, Katrine, because it seems like a case where this one really can be saved. This particular species, the genetics is there, the knowledge. There's one area, if you stop the fishing of the other illegal species, the totoaba. So how do you all balance that, the need to tell the individual stories with the big picture? Madhu, I know you're in the conservation side, sort of the policy end, but how does that play out for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's always the the charismatic big creatures that people want to know more about. And when somebody talks about the number of tigers in a country, everybody is interested. And I think it's sort of really important to focus on the non-charismatic species. In fact, I've spent a number of years championing the cause of critically endangered species in Southeast Asia. So, there are a large number of them, over 150 species in Southeast Asia are on the brink of extinction. And many of them are really, you could say, non-charismatic. They're frogs, they're turtles, well, non-charismatic to some people. So I think there are movements now to start to shine a light on some of these other species that are not the giraffes or the elephants or the tigers, but require as much attention, if not more, for their survival.
Yeah. One thing that I think about there too is there's some species virtually everywhere, even within Mexico City. That someone, whether it's a student or a class or a local campaign, can latch onto and can make it charismatic. And I've seen that in many places. Up here, there's the spotted salamander. I really care about salamanders because there's a invasive fungus poised to come to North America that's been spreading, and I would like to think that the diversity of salamanders we have in North America can be preserved, and so I've tried to make it as charismatic as I can. Salamanders are like the least visible thing. They lurk in the leaf litter, but those stories are all around. I don't know if anything comes to mind. Well, Rhett, with your almost famous series, you really captured this.
Well, yeah, I was just going to jump in. I tend to not think of them as being not charismatic, but lesser known, because any species has the potential to become charismatic if we tell a good enough story.
Yeah, right. People have done that with that little. The tardigrade with a microscope is really super.
Well, they're
cool.
like the charismatic, like ones that you can't see without a microscope. I feel like they have the market cornered on like the most charismatic animal that you need to see with a microscope.
Well, that would be a good Instagram campaign.
Oh, there are Instagram accounts. There are some great Instagram accounts.
We should. I should do another thing on that, and probably TikTok. It's probably TikTok. I'm sorry. It's probably there too.
There's this woman whose handle is like, I think it's Tarda Babe, and she posts the most amazing videos of creatures under microscopes, and they're so beautiful. I highly recommend her account.
I'll track her down. So what would be success? We'll get back to the conference too, because these do demarcate kind of trajectory. Madhu Rao, what do you think success would look like there?
Oh, at the conference,
Yeah.
I think success would be when there's a really ambitious global biodiversity framework adopted. That, for example, the target 3 is adopted as 30%, 30 by 30, which is 30% protected of seas and lands. I think success would also be linked to a strong monitoring framework. We have to measure how we're doing, so that would be important. Success would be measured by ensuring that the rights of indigenous peoples are actively integrated into relevant parts of the framework. And of course, finally, I would say financing. I think we need a huge step up in the additional financial resources that are needed to sort of feed the ambition that we're expecting the parties to adopt. So I would say success would sort of depend on some of these things.
And Janine, for you too, like, what's your story list look like? What are the key questions that relate there? I do know that for me, fully integrating indigenous interests into the treaty process seems really hard because it's sort of stuck. You have this original framework. It's what would success look like there too in the context of land conservation and the like?
Yeah, thank you, Andy. Yeah, that's a really important question. Well, from my perspective, and by covering these issues that I mentioned before, which are indigenous rights, equity, I am covering also health and production footprint. Well, I have realized that many people, most importantly, indigenous peoples and local communities, are calling for an agreement that can consider and taking into account the vote and the voices of these communities. And they also highlight the need to include a human rights-based approach in this global biodiversity framework, which is going to be implementing throughout this decade, and yeah, they call for this human rights perspective. For instance, the right to a healthy environment, it's pointed out as a really important issue that must be integrated in this framework. And also, well, other rights, for instance, indigenous peoples are calling for the right of the ownership of their own territories, because with this target called the 30 per 30 target, what is supposed to be is a kind of like a goal that can protect these lands and natural areas. But what is important here is that policymakers and stakeholders and negotiators here at COP15 can finally consider their rights to defend their lands, to share their traditional knowledge, to preserve their costumes, their perspectives of how to manage and how to conserve nature. Well, this is an issue, right? Like human rights perspective, but the other thing that I consider it's an important one in these negotiations is the mechanism the monitoring mechanism, which is called the ratchet mechanism, similar to the mechanism that is working with the Paris Agreement to monitor the implementation of this framework. I think this is very important because what NGOs, what civil organizations and indigenous peoples are, are looking at is at how does the world is going to ensure the protection and the conservation of nature and biodiversity. We need, they say that we need a framework that is really committed to these goals, and that we need to monitor these targets, which are like 21 targets in the framework, 21 or 22 targets in the framework. So yeah, I think that those topics are really important for these negotiations.
Just to tack on to that, I mean, I completely agree that the monitoring is one of the reasons that that the last biodiversity agreement failed so badly, right? Is because there was no monitoring. And so then you get to the end and you say, oh my gosh, none of these goals have been met. None of these targets have been met at the global level. So it's interesting because I think that people understand how important it is, but just given how much they have to get done in these 2 weeks, I have heard fears that some of this monitoring could be kind of the can could be kicked down the road, and how problematic it would be if that happened.
Sorry, yeah, Brett.
I was just going to jump in on the monitoring component. Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with what everyone said here. I think, relative to 12 years ago, we have made a lot of progress on monitoring. So I think the capacity is getting closer, much better. So we don't have the excuse of ignorance anymore. It's going to be really political will and commitment, because we can actually, through, you have satellites which can monitor, quality of habitat, but with, bioacoustics, network camera traps, environmental DNA, it's going to give us a much better picture of what's happening in these habitats with biodiversity.
Well, yeah, and this gets to the conservation enforcement too. The what happened with the ship tracking. Oh my God, I'm blanking on the
with the illegal fishing.
Yeah. There's lots of progress by using AI to sift data on ship movements that reveal not just the illegal fishing, but even the offloading of stuff. Some of that relates more to the other treaty, the the CITES agreement, which, Madhu, we were talking earlier about this. CITES is the treaty with teeth, right? This is more the aspirational goal driving treaty.
Yeah, Andy. So CITES is different in that there are accountability mechanisms built into CITES. So if there is non-compliance, you can have trade sanctions. So trade can be suspended with countries that are not in compliance. And that kind of accountability mechanism is not exactly there in the CBD. But I also just wanted to go back to this point of monitoring and the importance of it. And I agree, we have a lot more ways of monitoring our success or how we're doing because of the science, advancements in science, etc. But one of the main reasons why the previous targets were not met, why the CBD parties did not manage to meet the previous targets, was because there was failure in sort of the whole issue of mainstreaming biodiversity into the various sectors at the national level. So biodiversity needed to be on the economic agendas, and that was largely missing. So that was an equally important factor in the failure of meeting the previous targets.
But is that still the case? I mean, it's not like there are I don't know. It's the environment ministers who are in Montreal, right? It's not the other ministers who are joining them, or the heads of state.
Yeah, so I think just linked to that, it's this, I think you're absolutely right, Catherine. So it was only the environment, biodiversity was only an environment issue, whereas I think it's recognized now that it is a whole of government issue. Everybody, I mean, biodiversity has to be on the agriculture ministry map. It has to be on all the other sectors and go beyond the environment sector.
For sure, and the trade in illegal species is it's in the governance and enforcement and policing sector too. The vaquita is imperiled because of illegal fishery trade to China, and some of which goes through the United States. Sometimes it's really tangled, but it has to spill out of this niche. We're toward the end, and I know you're all busy with work, so I wanted to just get a last sense from you of where you go from here. Maybe Katrine, for what you can do with the New York Times, what are your goals, or what would you think we in the, I don't like mainstream media, but what can the BBCs, the New York Timeses of the world do that might be a little different? How much of what you want to, you have that film background and the like, if you had a dream, if someone gave you the go ahead to do sort of a dream package that you would think as a public service package around conservation, what would it look like?
Gosh, I would have to think that through more deliberately before answering, I think. Okay. But in terms of my dream package, I'll say two things. First of all, is like I'm focused. What am I doing next? I'm going to Montreal next week. I couldn't get away for 2 weeks, but I'm getting away for 1 week, so I'll be there for the second week of the conference. And I guess to me, what mainstream media like the New York Times really should be doing is making these issues, these environmental issues, as front and center as other issues that we cover exhaustively, right? We cover, there's also many interesting factors that go into news judgment and why we deem something to be more important than something else. And, sometimes like in my next life, I would want to be a media critic so I could like take some of this stuff apart. But I think that's where places like the New York Times really can do the right thing by not assuming that there's so much focus that's put on what's happening in Washington and the economy, right? There's so much focus on that. And I think we really, and I'm not just singling out the New York Times, but I work there. So, it's why I'm speaking about us in particular. But yeah, we could do better work on that front. And now we lost Andy, so he's given us instructions that if we lose him, we're just supposed to keep talking. So Rhett, what do you think that media should be doing differently or better? Or what is your dream package that you want to reveal to everyone listening?
Yeah, we need to put a little more thought into that. But yeah, I think it's great that New York Times, that you're able to do this in New York Times now and sort of mainstream the biodiversity coverage. And when you said that most people think of climate change being the primary driver of extinction or the biodiversity crisis, like to me, I'm just like, where does that come from? Because we focused on the habitat loss. So the fact that this is becoming better known is really important.
That's anecdotal. That's just my experience talking to people. But I did do like very informal polls. I'm talking like at dinner parties, at the dog park. Like, what do you think is driving by? Why are animals in trouble? And they'll be like climate change. So highly unscientific polling here.
Right.
Yeah. Thank you.
Sorry, go ahead, Andy. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, sorry. I'm glad you remembered my cue to keep the conversation going. Go, Rhett. Go, Rhett.
Well, yeah, I would love to see, more mainstream and biodiversity coverage in other outlets. Manga Bay, we're very focused on this. So our behavior isn't changing other than we're trying to expand and reach more people where they're at. So that means both like geographically, but also by language. And so we have ambitions to grow, next year, really with local reporters in these key biodiversity hotspots. I know that's not sort of like an all-encompassing vision, but I guess that's right. I'm at right now. But yeah, that's we do hope that this coverage does become more mainstream, and we're also able to bring in more of this great data that's being done by scientists to really inform the journalism and reach decision makers and the general public.
Yeah, I guess I would. If I had there was a question earlier about the Bezos Earth Fund that came up. I could put it on the screen, but the role of philanthropy here seems particularly potentially applicable. Where is that question? It was, well, anyway, it was what's the role of Bezos, Earth Fund, and the like. And I hope that there's more of a focus on facilitating that kind of distributed capacity to build the understanding of not just the value of, but the presence of biological specialness in every community on the planet. Too often, I think, I see money misspent in ways that expect some big outcome, some splashy thing, as opposed to just building that capacity, including for school systems to incorporate iNaturalists. So the kids walk into school, getting on their bus, can take a picture if they have a phone, and have it learn what it is. And that stuff then builds the capacity in all these different areas to raise the ambition at these conferences. I think, the media get this wrong so often, and the politicians drive this. We need to raise ambition, as if something that's going to happen in Montreal or in Sharm el Sheikh, some magical additional ambition at that meeting by leaders, as opposed to facilitating the dynamics at home that make it more doable. Well, it's been great to have. Sorry, Rhett.
I was going to say, I can speak to the philanthropy question just real quick. I mean, there
yeah.
Big search. So historically, very little money has gone into sort of biodiversity conservation. If you look at philanthropy, it ends up being like less than 1%, because most of the money that goes into like animals and conservation goes into domestic animals. So that's like animal shelters and things like that. So only a small fragment of it actually goes to biodiversity. Even a smaller fragment of that goes into international conservation issues. So there has been this big influx, I would say, in the last 3 years of kind of Bezos type money going into this space, which I think is important. But you also want to be sure it's well informed and going to the right places. And I feel like scientists and NGOs are helping shape that. So the money is going to be spent more effectively than it would have been, say, like 20 years ago. And really, it's been important to see that Indigenous rights and self-determination are being incorporated into this money that's being given versus like the old top-down fortress conservation approach.
Well, the more that we can do, the better. Thanks. It's great to meet you all here. Rhett, you and I have known each other a little while. This is my first time talking with Katrine. It's great that the Times is devoting space and resources to this. If I can help drive that conversation forward from the outside, I'm happy to. Madhu Rao, all that you're doing with the Wildlife Conservation Society, your work in South Asia on critically endangered species, and your work at the conference, good luck. And at IUCN. And Janine Quiroz, it's great to meet you too. I'm glad you're on this beat. I did some briefings and training with some Latin American journalists a few years ago on science environmental beat. It's wonderful to see growth in those areas as well. And I thought I'd close out with a little message from a species that is gone, that because of this fungus I just mentioned, or one of them, that's worth, let's get a species into the mix here. When I was at the New York Times still, let me just make sure I do this the right way so that you can hear it. Give me 1 second. Yeah, at the New York Times, because I had this blog, I could kind of do stuff a little bit offbeat. And I thought
you kind of got away with a lot, didn't you?
Well, yeah, I was my own editor, sort of. And then, especially when
You didn't have an editor?
Well, no, I was my own assignment editor. Let me put it that way. I had this. Oh, I bet I'm screwing up. It's not going to do the sound, which makes it useless. It was it's the Rab's fringe limbed tree frog, and it was the last recorded call of this frog was in in Atlanta at the Botanical Garden of the zoo. And I was going to let Tuffy have the last word here, but I might, if you have this 1 more second, hang in there. I'm going to try this 1 more time. I think I figured out the problem. Where are you, Tuffy? Oh, here we go. Yeah. So hopefully you'll hear this.
I wonder if Andy's frozen again.
Oh, geez.
There you go. Now you're back with us, Andy.
That says something. So we can do better than that, right? Thank you all for working on this. This is Andy Revkin, Columbia Climate School, Sustain What webcast. Apologies for the internet issue. And that was a piece I did for the Times for my .earth blog back in the day. Have a good weekend, and good luck to you all and what you're doing.
Thank you so much for
Thank
having us.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Take care.
Bye.
It was nice to meet you.
Great to meet you.